I call this meeting the Hurst-Euless-Bedford Independent School District to order. Let the record show that a quorum of board members is present, that this meeting has been duly called, and that notice of this meeting has been posted in accordance with Texas Open Meetings Act, Texas Government Code Chapter 551. Good evening to everybody. We'll get the meeting started with the President's statement. Tonight, the Board of Trustees is meeting in a called board work session meeting. The board welcomes and appreciates comments and input from the community. Open forum is provided at each meeting to allow the public to address the board. There will be two open forums tonight. Forum number 1 is to hear requests regarding agenda items only. Open forum number 2 is to hear requests or make comments regarding non-agenda items and will be heard at the end of the meeting. Those addressing the board are asked to limit their comments to 3 minutes per meeting. The speaker should identify his or her name, group affiliation, if any, and make a brief presentation with an identified solution if one is sought. Remarks should be addressed to the board as a whole. Oral presentations may not include any charges against an employee or board member by name. It is my responsibility to determine if the person addressing the board has attempted to resolve a concern informally or through the district's complaint policies. If not, the speaker will be directed to follow the appropriate policy. The board requests that all presentations be made in a courteous, respectful, and professional manner and asks that speakers monitor their own behavior. If you wish to speak during one of the open forums, please fill out one of the cards located on the table in the entry hall. Dr. Harrington, any comments?
Yes, the superintendent entry plan was included in the Friday update, and so we just wanted, if there was any feedback, we wanted to get that feedback. We plan on posting that tomorrow.
All right, would you like feedback at this time or feedback?
At any time.
Okay. Yeah. Well, if you have any feedback for Dr. Harrington on the plan, please contact him so you can post that tomorrow. Any clarifications required?
We had some questions from the last meeting, and they were included in the Friday update.
Okay. All right, we're ready for open forum number 1. Thank you. All right. First speaker is Mike Walsh, item 4.04. You'll have 3 minutes. It'll come up there as soon as you start speaking.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. My name is Mike Welsh. I live in Bedford. I have 2 boys who attend HEB schools. During the open session of the last school board meeting, I addressed my concerns regarding the careless behavior of one of our school board members. As I previously explained, I don't care what this individual does on his own time. However, not only did a questionable act occur, but he also proceeded to flaunt his behavior all over social media. This shows a complete lack of judgment on his part and the type of behavior that should not take place from a representative of our district. Furthermore, when questioned by a concerned parent regarding this behavior, he responded by saying, "Thank you for being a super fan and following me on social media." This really makes me scratch my head as to trying to figure out what he's trying to prove here. Honestly, I was embarrassed for him, the school board, and our community. At the conclusion of my statement on March 28th, my simple question was, what action will this board take in response to his behavior? In addition, I stated that I did not consent my tax dollars funding his trip to San Diego. I later learned he still attended the conference on taxpayer dollars in San Diego. So, as a concerned parent and taxpayer, I'm here tonight to ask, what has the board done to address this member's poor judgment, lack of professionalism, and arrogance? I look forward to your response after you discuss this later tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, our next speaker is Mary Lowe, speaking on agenda item 6.02.
Last time I was here, I referred to an open records request pertaining to monetary disbursements, and there has been communication on March 14th, March 21st, March 25th, and March 28th with Lisa, Theisen, all of which ask for clarity. I have asked for an opinion of an attorney as to whether or not this was specific and clear, and I've been assured that it was specific and clear. I have yet to receive any financial documentation regarding my open records request. This, I believe, is in violation of Chapter 55. I would really like for the school district to start knowing the law and adhering to the law. Every time I show up here, it's because you guys are choosing to either thumb your face at parents and disavow any law from any authority, or because you're simply not even respectful. And it would be really easy for this school district to just comply with the laws instead of subverting them. I would like to know when I can expect this information. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Stephen Beckman.
Two weeks ago, several members of the community stood before the board expressing concerns about the online behavior of one of our trustees, and more importantly, questioning his judgment and ability to execute his board duties. I emailed Mr. Romero following that meeting to ask what corrective measures the board planned on taking, as there appeared to be none at the time. I was informed that none had been taken since all members had not viewed the videos as of last meeting, but that you would, quote, likely be discussing it tonight in closed session. I hope that by now every member's had an opportunity to view the videos for themselves, but I want to make sure this board hears what the community brought you last meeting. Don't just view the videos in isolation, because the issues that were brought up aren't just that this member engaged in binge drinking, even binge drinking that apparently resulted in him blacking out and forgetting what happened for the rest of the day. In fact, as Mike just said, he wasn't interested, that community member was not interested in what the board member does on his own time. I want to make sure you don't overlook that the lack of judgment from this member demonstrates further than just the binge drinking itself. It's demonstrated that he advertised the behavior across all of his social media platforms. He's all but begging people to watch him drink himself into a drunken stupor. So in addition to making the initial decision to participate in this activity, he compounds the problem by drawing as much attention to it as possible. And you remember, each one of his social media platforms, his role as an HEBISD trustee is prominently advertised. It's on every landing page, even going so far as claiming to work for HEB on one site. He posts pictures taken during board meetings and district activities. He extensively highlights his association with HEB. Surely the board can see the problem here. Additionally, his responses to date regarding these videos are also problematic. As my wife shared last meeting, in response to her email condemning his behavior in attendance at the NASB conference, he thanks her for being a super fan and promises her a front row seat for the conference activities. That email could not have been more clear in condemning the behavior. So for him to arrive at the conclusion that she is a super fan shows an astonishing lack of self-awareness. Additionally, the pseudo-apology he offered that evening on Twitter shows a disgusting level of narcissism and arrogance. To claim that the community might have been missing context or doesn't understand what I or Eric do is offensive in its own right. Where do you get off talking down to members of the community like this, as though we just can't understand what the point of that exercise was? I hope the board takes these concerns seriously and looks at the overall pattern of behavior that has emerged from this member. Don't kid yourself into thinking that the only people in this room tonight are the only ones that have issues with it. District employees and other community members are talking about it. Students have seen it. You had the opportunity to censure him or exclude him from the NASB conference last meeting, and you failed to act. There were calls for him to resign his position, and I believe that's a fair request. There's no excuse for lack of action tonight. If he doesn't step down, then the board needs to request his resignation. Thank you.
Thank you. And next speaker is Miranda Beckman.
Good evening. I would like to share with you some things that will not go unnoticed tonight. It has not gone unnoticed that you moved the board activity chart review to the end of the meeting. Typically, this is one of the first items that the board talks through at each board meeting. I assume you're hoping that no one will be here when you cheerfully banter about your trip to the NSBA conference that taxpayers spent $21,000 on. I will sit and wait to hear just exactly what you learned at this conference. Even California has left NSBA. Shame on you. You all know it was a terrible decision to spend our money on attending this event, and I can't wait to hear how the students of HEB will benefit from this vacation that you took on my dime. It did not go unnoticed, as being a super fan, that this board member did not post anything about the conference since I was promised a front row seat in his email that he sent to me. I would like to know which sessions this board member attended. Every other conference you've attended, you have widely documented on Twitter. Why not this one? My guess is that you were asked by the board, and rightfully so, to ease off on your social media for the time being. Another thing that did not go unnoticed was your meal skipping on this trip, as you tend to post about most meals you eat. How exactly did you spend your per diem if you weren't eating on this trip? It will also not go unnoticed that this behavior was not addressed. It will not go unnoticed if this behavior is not addressed tonight by the board. At the last meeting, you went to the closed session for the shortest amount of time since I've been attending board meetings. That did not go unnoticed by those in attendance. This person also has a disbursement in the month of March, and I am beginning to wonder if this is a paying job for him. Now, something else that does not go unnoticed each month is the amount that HEB is spending with TK education consultants for reading and math improvements, and money that is spent to a former deputy superintendent of educational operations for continuous improvements. When are we going to see the return on these investments? When will our reading and math scores at the elementary level begin to rise? Another thing I noticed from this agenda is that you are updating many board policies tonight. However, none of these policies were added as attachments for your stakeholders' review so they could speak on these items. Here's a thought: why don't you amend the policy that allows for per diems to not just be handed over without receipts? I've also brought you an article tonight, which I hope you don't simply throw in the garbage like all the other things I've handed you before. There are some steps that you can take as a board to improve your relationship with parents. This article speaks about how parents like me no longer trust that you have my child's best interest in mind. You kept COVID protocols in place far too long. You've restricted access to library catalogs at the secondary level. Now you need a password to look at online textbooks. You continue to pay dues to NSBA and travel to this convention. You continue to use Canvas so that teachers can hide assignments that are not approved curriculum. Surveys are going out in the high schools, and you failed to address the technology concerns I've brought to you repeatedly. You have not been transparent this year. Your lack of interaction with parents like me has not gone unnoticed. You refuse to interact with concerned parents despite many attempts to communicate with you. If you continue to lack transparency and refuse to talk to parents who reach out to you, then more than one person on this board needs to step down.
All right, thank you. And just for clarity, during work sessions, the review of the board activity chart is always at the end. It's only during our regular meeting that we discuss where we've been that month.
Well, it's sad that that's the only thing you've ever said to me in all the times I've spoken at these meetings.
Just wanted to make sure it was clear. All right. All right, we are going to hold our closed session at the end of the meeting. So right now, we will go down to reports and presentations. Education Resource Group, update.
Good evening this evening. Heather Tower Reed. Did I say that backwards, Heather? It's fine. Is going to present for us, and she is really an in-house expert and has provided us with a great deal of detail tonight. I think you will find it very interesting what she has to share and where our schools are currently sitting in terms of ERG. Thank you.
First, I want to say thank you very much for having us here. We've had a long-standing relationship with Hurst-Euless-Bedford, and we really appreciate the work that has happened in this school district over we are probably getting close to almost a 20-year relationship. So you have remained one of our highest performing school districts, both in terms of academic performance as well as financial efficiency, making you one of the most productive school districts in the state. So thank you for having us here, and we're glad to keep presenting to you guys to give you kind of our view of the state of Hewlett-Bedford via the ERG lens. Just to begin with, one of the things that ERG does is we are not an accountability rating system. That's not what we do. What we do is we help you with the tools that we have to help you manage the school district better, to understand how your district is doing relative to other school districts, how your campuses are doing relative to other campuses, and we can even drill down to the teacher and to the student level as well. And all of these things are designed to do a couple of things. One, first of all, how well is your organization truly doing? And relative performance is a wonderful way of doing that. Ratings just lump us into a category, whereas relative performance, when I say HEB is the #1 most productive school district in the state, I can say that backed by data, also because we've ranked the school district. So that is a piece of data we know. So it's like walking into the mall. You have to start off with how well are we doing? What's our starting point before we can determine where we're gonna go next to make improvements? And that's the next piece, is what are we going to do? What areas do we need to go to work on in order to continue to be one of these high-performing school districts? Another thing that ERG allows you to do is because we do input all of the data from all school districts across the state, it also allows you to identify in those areas that perhaps you're looking to find improvement, where can we go to get better? Who are those folks who are doing it better than we are? And what can we learn from them? We use that all the time in our teacher models and how we grow our teachers. We use that for our principals. Why not even use it for the district? But again, in a rating system, it's sometimes hard to identify who to go to, who are those folks. But with ERG, you can do that easily. And fourthly, are those improvement strategies working? So one of the best things about having been with HEB for as long as we have is that this is not a one-time thing. You have to do this every year to get better. It's like going on a weight loss program and stepping on the scale once and declaring victory, even though you don't know where you started from. It's a process, and this is a process that your leadership team engages in year after year after year, and we commend that, that you keep revisiting this data and this view of how the district is doing. Because one of the greatest challenges to improvement is really the difficulty that organizations have in seeing themselves as they actually are. You know yourself, the hardest thing to do is to look in the mirror and accept your strengths as well as your weaknesses. So how are we doing? And that is something that this tool definitely helps you do. Oops, I went too far. How do I back it back up? There it goes. All right, one of the things I wanted to talk about that has changed a little bit, not since the last time that I've seen most of you folks, but the accountability system, since we moved to A through F, mirrors more closely ERG's methodology. That is not without accident, in that the commissioner has been a great friend of ours from his time when he was in Dallas and admired the work that we did. Now, of course, A through F has taken on different as we're seeing here in terms of what would be domain A. ERG stands by what kind of the methodology we've been using all along. Our balanced scorecard is a little bit different than the domain 1, primarily because college, career, and military readiness indicators are too new and they change too frequently to use as a benchmarking tool to measure how effective the district is. So until that settles down, we have opted to stick with the measurements that we've almost always used. I think the newest measurement in there is college-ready graduates, which got introduced to the system in either 2006 or 2008, I can't remember. Of course, we changed the labels on the state standardized testing as well, but they still represent the same thing. But this is how we weight what we would call our domain A. It's the ERG Achievement Index, or domain 1. The other domains mirror us as well. In a moment, we'll talk about performance and how we look at performance, and that's domain 2, part 2. But we even have components that domain 2, part A is mirrored off of what we did as well. So the new accountability system really does, although we are not trying to rate school districts, the methodologies are similar, and so in that way, our tools are really helping you succeed in both managing the school district as well as improving accountability ratings in the end. All right, so this is how ERG, when we talk about the achievement index, we use each one of these components and weight your performance on each one of those. We do a weighted ranking based off of those percentages that you're seeing right there. So 20% on each of the 3 STAR tests, 10% on the post-secondary measures, which are graduation rates, college-ready graduates, SATs, and ACTs, okay? As I just mentioned, one of the other things that accountability has come to do that mirrors ERG so well is domain 2, part 2, the relative performance piece, taking into account our demographics. It has long been accepted that the demographics we serve has an impact on student outcome. We all know that when it comes to the students that we are trying to reach. But what doesn't always happen, and did not happen until A through F, without that component, is it didn't recognize the challenges that school districts that have challenging demographics have to face when educating those kids. So when we looked at straight achievement scores, of course, those districts like Highland Park and Carroll were always ranked #1 because they had not as challenging student mixes in terms of, again, the socioeconomic status of the students who are attending. So how do we adjust for that? We use a simple regression model, and I liken it to a height weight chart, right? Basically, the more economically disadvantaged students we have, the data shows us that performance goes down. The real question is who's doing the best with the students that they have? Who is truly effective in educating all of their students? So here's an example, 2 school districts. Both have a pass rate on this measure that we're looking at of about roughly 53%. But the one on the left has about 25% economically disadvantaged students, while the one on the right has 85% economically disadvantaged students. If in the old achievement systems we were to be looking at these 2 school districts, at 53% of their students passing, they would be rated exactly the same. But once we take into account this student mix into the view of how we're looking at performance, the school district on the left with the 25% economically disadvantaged students is underperforming where the model predicts that they should, while the school district on the right is far exceeding its expected pass rates. So that blue line is the expected pass rate. So again, I mentioned it's like a height weight chart. So if I know my height and my weight, I know, and obviously my gender, where I should be, again, on an expected value. The doctor says, oh, well, you should be 125 pounds. This is your ideal weight. So the actionable information becomes, am I over or under? Same thing here. Am I over or am I under? So how effective am I? Now, one of the things that has changed with HEB is that your demographics have improved a little bit over the last couple of years. Between 2019 and 2021, on average, the district's economically disadvantaged percentage dropped from 55% to 51%. All right, or actually 56% to 51%. So it's a 5% change. So that means your expectations in terms of our performance index go up as well. All right, so just keep that in mind. So that is there. But the idea, again, is that we create a level playing field so that that district with 85% economically disadvantaged students can be measured on the same playing field as a Highland Park, a Carroll, and an Eanes, which are all represented over there on that left-hand side of the graph. They're all exceeding their expected pass rates very, very well. But now this school district that's on the far right, that's circled, we can identify as exceeding it by 22.4%. While that district with 25% economically disadvantaged students is falling short by almost 5%. All right, so they're leaving cards on the table. There's more that they could be doing with the kids that they're serving. All right, any questions right now? All right, we're going to, just as a quick recap, achievement has a strong bias towards the district and campuses that have a low percentage of economically disadvantaged students. And performance, or our performance index, uses the same indicators. It just removes the socioeconomic bias and offers the opportunity to identify highly effective organizations, the people who run them, and the programs that are implemented there. All right, we're talking about effectiveness. And again, it mirrors more about what the state has been doing now that we are in the A through F accountability system. So let's talk about Hurst-Euless-Bedford and where you kind of fit. One of the things that we came up with at the very, very beginning was our ERG performance matrices. Now this one is the academic matrix. So on the x-axis, or on the horizontal at the bottom, we have, the achievement index. So that's the non-adjusted, just achievement scores, weighted rankings based off of that performance scorecard I showed you earlier. While on the Y, or the vertical axis, are our performance index. So that's the demographically adjusted numbers. So the desire is to be up and to the right. That is both high achieving and high performing. All right. So that red dot is HEB. You guys have been in that box for as long as we've been working with you guys. All right, that's just, in our minds, where you belong, and if we start seeing things move backwards, we talk to you. So great news there, high performing and high achieving. There are other school districts, though, that you can see that are further up and to the right than you are, And so those kind of become your chase districts. As I mentioned before, we can identify those school districts that are high performing. So what are these school districts doing that are exceeding what we're doing here at Hurst-Euless-Bedford? What might we be able to learn from them? And let me tell you, I've been to some of these other school districts who say that they've sent people here to do the exact same thing. Okay. On the right, we have the productivity matrix. What this one does is it incorporates your financial efficiency, which are based off of 2020 numbers right now. We did have 2020 data there. 2021 was just released, but they haven't released some other files that we need to validate the data. So until we can validate it and make sure that it's right, it doesn't go in the system. All right. So once that's there, we'll be giving you another update. But HEB has been one of the most productive school districts in our almost 20 years of working with you guys. No matter what the system's been, TOS, TAX, STAR, you've stayed up there. There have been years that you have bobbled from #1, but I don't think you've ever been out of the top 5, and certainly not in recent years. So in terms of how you use your resources and generating student outcomes, that you're both financially efficient, again, create high student outcomes once we adjust for demographics, that makes you a highly productive school district. Very financially responsible. All right, so what changed between 2019 and 2021? Of course, COVID happened, and we all know that, and everybody had to face those challenges. There's still some other data that we're waiting to come in on the financial side to kind of see what kind of funding issues might have come into place, and Dr. Harrington and I have actually talked about that, and so we're looking to see what happens when that data comes out. But HEB held relatively steady. You moved a little bit down in terms of the performance index. Achievement stayed about the same, but you'll notice that your dot came down just a little bit, so it just came due south. Now, 2 noticeable changes. You'll also notice that Carroll also came down, all right? So they stayed that far right on achievement, but their performance came down as well. The other big change were 2 other school districts. Katy and Conroe nudged their way between you and Carroll. All right, so there are perhaps things that can be learned from Katy and Conroe. All right, so as I mentioned, you know, that's one of the great things about the tool is that you can identify those folks who you might learn something from. As I mentioned, the one big area that we saw change in between 2019 and 2021 was in the performance index. Your achievement index percentile ranking stayed exactly the same, 81.9. All right, so relative to other school districts, your ranking stayed the same in achievement. What went down was your performance. It went from the 97.9th percentile down to the 94.9 percentile. So that's a 3 percentile drop. And again, what we saw happening with achievement staying the same, but your demographics improving, what does that mean? Your expectation gets higher for performance. All right, so that's where we saw that shift. At the very bottom, again, that's the NA because we don't have 2021 in there, just 2020. But again, you can see the longitudinal there that you've been at the top for a long, 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 long time in terms of the financial index. So we don't have reason yet to see that change, and the red dots are our predictive models. So we anticipate some of those things holding pretty steady over the next few years. Any questions so far? All righty. When we dig in a little bit deeper, and this is just, again, a very narrow slice of the pie, there's over 1,200 data points that ERG tracks in the system and uses a relative ranking to look at. So this is, again, just a very thin slice of the ERG view, but it is the high view of what goes into our indexes. So areas that we saw backward movement, including in terms of achievement, and this is, again, in terms of your relative ranking. So even if your performance and approaches had stayed exactly the same, and in fact, most people's did drop in 2021, which we would expect start scores to drop at approaches after COVID and everything. The question is what was your rate of change relative to everybody else? And you experienced a slightly faster backward movement in terms of your star scores than your peers. So a little bit over 5% in approaches, about 5%, just right at 5% in meets, and about 5% in masters as well. So across the three, your relative position to your peers dropped by about 5% in each of the 3-star pass achievement areas, or performance areas. In terms of the post-secondary measures, the only one that we saw backward movement on would be the college-ready graduates. So that is the only piece that we saw a decline. And in fact, we saw the district's average SAT scores and ACT scores go up quite a bit in terms of its relative performance to other school districts. You were sitting at roughly 68, 69% in both, and went up to 82%, the 82nd percentile and the 78th percentile, respectively, on SATs and ACTs. So improvement on the college admissions testings, which is good to see, and hard for a lot of folks to do. Usually that's an area that stays super, super consistent, and there's not a lot of movement there. Even after we adjust for demographics, so that's the bottom, again, these are the same measures on the bottom half of this table, just now adjusted for demographics. We see similar changes, maybe not quite not full 5% on each of the performance pieces by star. But what we do see now is that after we adjust for your graduation rates, that even though that had shown improvement in terms of raw achievement once we adjust for demographics, actually there was a slight backward movement there by about 4%. And then we saw that your college-ready graduates, you'll notice that in that actual value for 2021, it's in brackets, 2.5. That means you scored 2.5% below what that model would predict, where that blue line would be in terms of your college-ready graduates, all right? So 2.5% below where expected. Once you rank that against everybody else, that puts you in the 50th percentile. Now again, with the SATs and ACTs, after even adjusting for your demographics, we saw those go up as well. All right, so areas to go to work, college-ready graduates is a concern, but really the 3-star components is, even though achievement stayed relatively steady, you need to, other folks did better while y'all moved backwards just a little bit. All right, questions? Good? All right. We use the same kind of methodology as, again, as the state when it comes to looking at campus-based performance at elementary and middle schools. It is solely related on the 3-star performance measures. High schools mirrors our achievement and performance index. So again, instead of college-ready graduates, we use the 4 post-secondary measures. So now what we're looking at is how, just like we just looked at how the district changed over the last since 2019 to 2021, is I wanted to look at the movement of your elementary schools from 19 to 21. So a couple of things that kind of jump out, and one of the reasons that we put our data points into a matrix like this is so that you can see patterns quickly, right? What kind of movements do we see? And what we saw is that, you had this tight clustering of your elementary schools with, just those few down below the yellow line, but they were kind of centered in that green box, and it's kind of spread out a little bit. All right, so we've had a little bit more disbursement, so that a little bit more variation between our different performance levels. A couple of the big movers, of course, one of the things that we like to keep an eye on are who are those folks that fall below the midline, right? Who are those folks? Because that midline, again, are those campuses that are exceeding expected values given the demographics that they serve. So we saw it's Shady or Spring Garden. So Spring Garden went down, and Lakewood kind of dropped down in that matrix even further in terms of their performance given their demographics. Now, when we look at Veridian, on the other hand, Veridian is all the way up in the top right. Okay, demographics in some of these campuses changed though. So again, something to keep in mind. But when we talk to our staff and set goals for the principals, so on and so forth, keeping these things in mind are important. Your demographics change, so your expectations change. How are you going to change your programs and what you're delivering to your students to meet their needs and grow them regardless of how they're coming to you, whether they're socioeconomically or whether they're are disadvantaged or whether they're GT, your job is still to grow them, all right? So it changes the conversation as your demographics change. So that's kind of, those were some of the big standouts to me in terms of your campuses. So again, we saw 2 of those campuses really drive down further into the yellow, but we saw some upward movement as well. And so like, let's see, Hurst-Hills went up. Shady Oaks, we saw their dot move up, whereas South Euless kind of came down in the matrix. So Shady Oaks went almost to where South Euless used to be, and South Euless is now kind of down in that bottom band of green right next to North Euless. All right. So those were a couple of the biggest movements that I saw in the graph. And just, again, one of the ways that we use to visualize and say, how are we going to attack this? Now, we look at that a little bit more closely, and one of the other tools that we put together for your leadership team is we actually will look at what the changes were for each one. And one that I forgot to mention, too, that went backwards, perhaps one of the most dramatic was Midway Park. Fell back 13%, or had a ranking change of 13% in both the achievement and the performance index. All right. So this allows us, again, just a quick color coding view of identifying who went up. So we do have things to celebrate. Hurst-Hills is something to celebrate. Bel Air, Donna Park, and Stonegate and Viridian all showed lots of improvement in very challenging times. All right. So we can now have different ways to celebrate folks and also different ways to frame our conversations in terms of where we want to go to find improvements. Did the same thing with the middle schools, and I kind of saw the same dispersion. All right. So they were all kind of clumped closely together back in 2019, and they kind of split out a little bit. Now, this split out a little bit more predictably than what I saw in the elementary schools, and that those 2 that were already on the left side of the grouping just kind of moved further to the left, and those that were center to the right moved, more to the right and lined up that way. So again, but keep in mind, they're all in the what we call the 1-1 box. They're in our highest performing and highest achieving combined box. All right, so that's great news, but we do have challenges there in terms of how they performed relative to other middle schools across the state. We saw a little bit of backward movement on average, right around, again, 5% once we do all the averages on all the campus movements across both the performance and the achievement index. High schools. High schools, a little bit less movement here, a lot more steadiness. In fact, we saw improvement at Keys. I know Keys is kind of a unique case. And Trinity and Bell both saw improvements, especially in terms of achievement. We saw a lot go up, but Keys had the biggest improvement in terms of performance. Again, demographics in the districts changed a little bit overall, so we saw performance at Bell and Trinity go down slightly, but achievement went up. So that, again, achievement went up, but did it go up at the same rate that your demographics changed? All right, any questions?
All right, you have any questions on this report?
I have a few questions. So I'm looking at slide 13. Again, thank you for being here. I appreciate the information. We've not met. I'm new, so I have some questions because I have not seen this as much as everybody else has. But if you were looking at the elementary schools, and if you had the same achievement 2019 to 2021, but your demographics dictated a change in performance based on where you should be, do you have those numbers to share with us at a later time on the demographics of each of these schools and how they were affected for these scores?
Yes.
And was there a large disparity between schools within the same district?
There were some significant changes, but overall, the change, again, was relatively moderate. And I would have to delve into each one to say with any kind of certainty to tell you what our data says about it. So I looked at larger trends for today instead of delving deeply into any one, but I'd be happy to work with the board as well as the administrative team in order to answer those questions for those campuses. But all of that detail is in the system and accessible to you guys, to your leadership team to analyze.
And that's something I'd like to see, because if there are challenges that certain schools are facing that other schools are not facing,
Right.
that show in these data points, I would just like to have an idea of some of the challenges they're facing and where they're facing them.
Absolutely. That's what the system is absolutely designed to do.
Also for the performance, when you talk about comparing us to either districts or schools who have the same demographic makeup as we do, could you share that with us as far as school by school, what schools
Sure.
those schools are being compared to, where those schools, what school districts those schools are in, so we have some sort of idea of a grouping of these schools and who they're being compared to, as opposed to some of the other schools in our same
Yeah.
district and who they're being compared to?
So what ERG does in terms of our methodology, and one of the things that we do, again, that's different than the state, especially at the district level. At the district level, when you look at Domain 1 or even Domain 2, Part 2, you're looked at relative to, or not even relative, you're ranked against all other school districts in the state. ERG has a different view in that one of the things we realized early on when we started doing this, again, 20 plus years ago, is that size of school districts matters. So we broke out our school districts according to divisions based on size. So it's just like UIL. So HEB, Hurst-Euless-Bedford, is part of what we call our ERG Division 1 schools, which are the 200 largest school districts in Texas. There are 4 other divisions also made up of 200 school districts that are then broken out according to size. But the majority of the school districts, roughly 83% of the total student population in Texas, is represented by the 200 largest school districts, of which, again, HEB is one. So when we're comparing your district, we're looking at your district relative to that group of 200 largest. When we look at campuses, we break out campuses not according to district size. So when we're looking at elementaries, when I say your elementary, or when I look, let's just talk about right now, since we have the high school data up. When I say Trinity High School is ranked in the 82nd percentile in the performance index, that's relative to all high schools in the state. So that, as long as they don't mask data and we can include their data in the system, that is a statewide ranking at the campus level. So when we look again at like your, your two major high schools, when we say they're in the top quartile, they're in the top quartile of all high schools in the state. Same thing with your elementary schools. So that's how we break out our data in terms. There is no other breaking out according to trying to match you according to demographics, because once you make the adjustment in the performance index for socioeconomically disadvantaged students, making any additional adjustments for ethnicity or any of the other demographics has, again, we run all the studies on this. There's no correlation. So why predict your models and make them more complicated than they have to be? One of our most famous, what we say all the time, what we quote all the time is, there are no perfect models, just some are more useful than others. And so to complicate the model and to add and try and restrict it to fewer campuses or fewer districts that look like you means that we might restrict folks that you could learn something from who are perhaps performing better than you. So again, if we were to talk about Conroe's demographics are actually very similar to HEB's. And so that would match. Now, you may not choose Katy. Their demographics are a little bit different than HEB's. So that might not be a school district that you would normally compare yourself to, but you can still learn from them because, yes, their achievement's better, probably based, again, in part due to their demographics, but that their performance is exceeding yours. What are they doing to be even more effective regardless of the demographics they're serving. So those are the reasons that the only adjustment that we make in terms of our model is looking at that performance index, but it does not affect our groupings. Now, the district has the ability, as they are trying to work with the system and again, identify folks that they're going to target for improvement, to create custom peer groups. So we can do that at the district and the campus level. But this high-level data is all based off of those groupings, as I said, either size based off of the district level, campus by campus type, statewide.
Very good. Thank you. One more question on slide 9. This has the projections for achievement and performance out through 2024. It's either, the achievement is either holding steady or slightly decreasing. Performance is slightly decreasing.
Correct.
Are the inputs that are giving you this data the test scores specifically, such that if our test scores improved, you would then project us to go up? Or are you seeing something else other than test scores that are making you spit out these decreasing lines?
No, we again use the exact same components as what we do in the index. But what we've done to create our predictive models, and it's a standard model. It's a 3 and 5 year combined model. So we take 3 years of moving average data points and 5 years. Difference is most econometric models weight them equally, with education being the way it is, and we have, yearly mandates that we're having to adjust to. We put 60% of the weight on the 3 year moving average and only 40% of the weight on the 5 year moving average. So all we're doing is looking at past trends to predict future trends. So there's no additional inputs into the system.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have one question, and this may be more for maybe Conrad or Darla. What is the correlation in all the campuses across the board that had the highest drop compared to the amount of kids we had online? Because I know, like, some of our campuses, we had a really high online, and some we had a higher in-person for the 2020, this is 2022, so it would have been 2021 school year.
So I want to be careful that I don't have any data in front of me, but I'll speak to secondary at least for the moment. You saw that Hurst-Euless, and again, I want to remind you, still in the 1-1, so you're really good. You dropped a little bit. You're still really good. Those two campuses, and again, I don't have it sitting in front of me, they were pretty heavily impacted by some major, through COVID. They had a larger number of students frequently out. We had to shut down, I believe it was Hurst and Euless at different times. So their impact was greater than we saw at some of our other schools, especially Bedford and Harwood. Now, Harwood went through some pretty tough times too, but if you look at the demographics, Hurst and Euless have slightly different demographics across the board than those other 3 campuses. So just from standing here and answering that question, I would say that would be an impact that we had because those students were in school as much. And then when you look at the 2 high schools, they also had almost 50% of their students online for an entire year.
Okay.
And so that would, we all know that online students, that data looked different than students that were in class.
Right, yeah, and I know that Hurst and Euless had, did they even hit 50% by the end of the year, maybe just a little over? But even at the elementary level, like, it seems the schools that took the hardest hits on achievement were the ones that, like South Euless had a really high percentage of kids online, right?
Darla, I want to be careful. In my new role, I'm getting there, but I just left secondary, so
Well,
do you want to contribute
As
to
we
that?
look at this, I think that we need to put that variable in there, that yes, we're all concerned that the data has dropped, but we didn't have a lot of control over how many kids actually came to school.
Yeah, absolutely, and I did want to ask this question, Heather, since you're here. You had talked about using the 3-year, so that means we included 2019, 2020, the COVID year, correct?
Yes, we did.
So that's accounting for 60% of that moving 3-year average versus the 5-year. So I think that's the
2020 and the 2021 data.
right. So that
In and
data.
of itself could be skewed because we had so many kids online.
Well, I don't want to use the word skewed, but yes, that data will look probably different. I think this year's measure will be interesting to see how we do this year, and I don't know how that will impact our trend moving forward. But again, we are using at least 2 data points, well, 1 data point for sure during the pandemic, which had a greater impact on our scores than we've seen in the past. That still doesn't mean we don't need to be careful and watch where that trend's going, but I think it will be interesting to see when that falls off the 3-year and moves to the 5-year.
Okay, great.
And I hope I didn't missay any of that.
Yeah, and I will just add, Rochelle, that's a great question. Some campuses, there's a bigger correlation than others to online students. But another thing is, some schools had more students absent because of, and on quarantine, and had shutdowns. And so I think that is a factor too, maybe more so than the actual number of kids that were online. Just another factor.
All right, any additional questions? All right, I just want to say how much, this board has appreciated our relationship with ERG over the years. This is always great information. For me, ever since I came on the board, I really liked the idea that we could, compare ourselves to similar districts, because it's really about how much you're growing students and how much you're engaging with the students that you have, not necessarily the end run. I think every student should be judged based off of how much they grow year over year.
Absolutely.
Not over other things. That really shows how effective our school district is. So we really appreciate that data, and we really appreciate it getting broken down more school by school, because that really helps open up our eyes and lets us know a little bit more where we need to work. And we know that we had kids online, but we know these other districts had kids online, so it's really hard to compare and say, this is any kind of excuse. And we're not up here to make excuses. We're up here to make improvements. So that's what I want us to focus on is looking at where we are. It's always been great. I think the first 6 years, every report was positive and up and up and up, and now we have one that's a little bit down. Still good, but a little bit down, and we want to acknowledge that and work together to do what we need to do to next year we'll have a all green report.
That's right. That's what we always hope to. And, one of the things that I do want to close with is that we always say is, getting to the top in public education, that's hard. But staying there is even harder. So kudos to you guys for the job that you do here. And again, thank you for including us to be a part of your journey.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Were there any questions on disbursements for the month of March 2022? All right. District benchmark assessment. Dr. Norgard.
It is a fun night of numbers.
It's my favorite.
All right, so I am coming to you with specific test data from our junior high math DBA 1. We call it DBA 1. It's the only DBA we give in math. So as a reminder, this is all interim data related to our quality indicators pertaining to meets and master's grade level when we reach STAR. And a little context here. So 7th and 8th grade math, when you look at the chart of our year-to-year performance, different groups of 7th graders, different groups of 8th graders, you will see I've always included the dates because sometimes when in the year we're giving those DBAs has changed, and you will definitely see movement in these two areas. Some of that is due to the way the state has moved the schedule, and when they dropped SSI from 8th grade, there weren't two administrations. So it has a small impact, so I just want to be sure to point that out, the number of days of instruction prior to the DBA, or even on the intervention we do between DBA and STAR, because that's when we get that next jump. And a reminder that because of the differences we saw in our trend data, that only traditional students' DBA data from last year is included. So here is our year-to-year trend. Because you see this test under date given has always been given after spring break in 2019-20, I did not report on any data to this group. Now, we had CBA data, we had unit tests, we had common formative, there were other things happening in the schools that year, but I did not report on data to you for this group in 19-20. So they dropped coming back during the pandemic, our traditional only students, but you can see this current year performance is exceeding where we were pre-pandemic. So we've put a lot of things in place in math. We had a lot of research last year that told us that actually math was one of the greatest things to suffer by not being face-to-face, and even when they were face-to-face, not putting hands on materials because we weren't sharing materials and those kinds of things. So we're definitely seeing we've got them back. We're doing those practices that we know to be best practices for math, and the data is showing that. So for our performance objectives targets, we're already exceeding those from where we are, and we're looking for more growth between now and STAR. Because the more growth between now and STAR, since we're back to pre-pandemic DBA, I expect us to be back to pre-pandemic kind of growth. You know, last year, what we saw from DBA, there wasn't a lot of movement between DBA and where we ended up at STAR. But now that we're back and also able to do those interventions based on DBA data, now let's pull some small groups differently. Now let's, you know, loop back to this content. You know, we want to get back to not just the level of scoring, but the level of improvement we would see between DBA and STAR. So that's why, even though we're already above the targets, I want to see this kind of direction in that, which will then adjust our targets for the following year. So now when I look at this group of students, my current 7th graders and how they have performed over time, you can see a little bit of up and down movement back when they were in elementary school, and of course a drop off. The last unified data point we had that I would report to the board for them would have been their 5th grade DBA. Then they had no STAR test, but when they came back in 6th grade, it was lower, but they have continued to climb. So this group is continuing to show improvement across every opportunity that we give them to show us their mastery of content. So in 8th grade, you'll also see again, we did get a test in, and I mentioned the moving around. That was the first year we had ever given a DBA before spring break. That's why it's the only one that got one in before we closed down. So we did have a DBA, just not STAR, for 8th graders in 2019-20. But you can see again, we are exceeding this top line of pre-pandemic. I do want to point out for context, when we look at 8th grade, this master's number, I don't like to see a big number there, because as a reminder, our advanced students should be taking the algebra EOC, not the 8th grade math STAR. So the larger this number gets, to me, that's missed opportunity. We should have pushed those students into the advanced class. And in fact, we target these students, if they were still sitting in 8th grade math and showing this level of mastery, we talk to them about where they might double up, where there are opportunities in the summer to accelerate, to get them on a path where they could end up in calculus if they choose, or our IB mathematics programs. So this number, it's a weird way to think. We want to push people to masters, but in 8th grade, it's okay to have a small number there. So we are also exceeding the targets there. Same thing though with, we weren't seeing the shift between DBA and STAR to get there. So we're already hitting these pre-pandemic levels. Let's get that next pre-pandemic step to set even higher goals. So for this group, their cohort from all the way back when they were in 3rd grade, you can see some ups and downs along the way. They did not have a data point in 6th grade because they did not have data points that I report to you. They had CBAs and other assessments within their classes, so that's why that's kind of a gap, a break in theirs. But you'll see, like with 7th grade, climbing other than this master's. And again, because 7th grade, both our advanced academics and our on-level students were all taking the same STAR test, and this year they're split between 8th grade math and algebra. For algebra, there's 2 lenses through which we have to view the data for 2 different purposes. So first, I'm going to show you combined results for our grade 8 ADVAC. That is our new pre-AP term. So I can't say it without hearing the little Aflac duck. It's ADVAC, but pre-AP is a licensed term. So we have adjusted to advanced academics, and we're going to look together at grade 8 ADVAC and our grade 9 on-level algebra students, because that's the way we set our district targets. You're all taking algebra, we've set them. There are other ways that we look at the data separately, but that's why we need to look at them combined. But that also means in this section, I don't show you the student cohort history, because I cannot, from sitting where we are, go back and break out, well, these students started in 6th grade advanced academics. Oh, wait, these jumped over to advanced academics in 7th grade. It's just not clean. I could, but it wouldn't be up to my standards of the way I want to really project the data to you. There'd be too much wiggle room in there. So when I look at this combined performance here in green, I can still show you approximately 1/3 of our algebra students are 8th graders. Our ADVAC 8th graders are about 1/3 of the total number of students we have testing in algebra this year. And we see, a different level of standards, but what we're tracking with trends is this combined data. So those are the performance objective targets set on combined data. And when you see the history of the combined data, this is not the same picture as we saw for 7th and 8th grade, because here we were pre-pandemic, and while these are beautiful green arrows, and I love to see us going up, we're not back to where we were pre-pandemic in algebra. and we're going to talk just a little bit more about that. I do not in any way want to discount these gains. These are great. We are happy to see this movement, but there is still cards on the table, meat on the bone, whatever is your favorite metaphor there to do with our algebra students. But we are exceeding the targets, but not good enough because we're not back to where we were pre-pandemic. So we did see a little more growth during the COVID year from DBA to STAR, this group compared to some of the others that were pretty much flat. So let's see if we can get that kind of growth again. I'm going to separate them also for you, though, because we do need to look at the grade 8 ADVAC and the grade 9 on level, because this potentially impacts distinction awards for our junior highs. When schools are put into their comparison groups, you know, here are 40 schools that you're all fairly similar and you've got to be in the top quartile to earn a distinction. You think about the unique structure that we have of our junior high model. So for these schools, we have 7th, 8th, and 9th graders in the mix. So that means those on-level 9th grade algebra scores and our 8th advanced. You compare us to middle schools that only have 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, their algebra scores only include advanced 8th graders. So this is something that our junior highs have to keep an eye on. They continue to earn the distinction in math. They are getting it done, but it's something we've got to keep our eye on because of comparisons that are made. So that is why we also look at this data separately. So when I look at this trend, I love this chart. So these are our ADVAC grade 8 algebra students. This group is back to pre-pandemic norms. So kind of that thing I pointed out before. Now I've got an even more focused look because I need to look at 9th grade. Okay, so in some areas we are coming back. Our 9th graders are improving compared to this, but these were our biggest losses last year. And actually, if we think about this cohort of students, our 2 biggest losses in math last year were grade 8 math and algebra. This year's students sat in grade 8 math, so they didn't bring as strong a grade 8 base into their grade 9 algebra experience. So they have room to grow, and we need to continue to watch that trend. So really this pre-pandemic to post-pandemic, the masters, we're looking closer, but really this approaches and meets, we've got to have our eye on. So some of what we've talked with you about previously this year, and you have previously approved, Intensified Algebra is a pilot that we are starting in as an additional model to our STAR algebra classes, that second hour of math, how to block it, and some additional instructional resources. We've been to visit some other districts that were using it because we need to target these numbers right here. They are coming back, but we want them to come back more. So the focus of junior high when responding to the data, what we're doing is working. We just need to do more of it. There's been a large focus this year on their training with Alan Lohman Consulting, and there's kind of 4 areas that he focuses. One is helping teachers understand how to help students engage their brains at all levels. He calls that establishing framework, that you don't just talk about it, but you help students see it, write it, act it, really engage at all levels in that framework. And then providing study guides. How do students structure their studying? Because information that is not organized is not remembered. So really, they're entering their high school career, they're in junior high, but this is a high school credit. Really, how do we think? How do we organize that information to carry forward? Looking at daily warm-ups, and that warm-ups aren't just 2 problems that I picked and put on the board. How do I carefully select things to engage students' brains that are going to look both at the skills and the higher order thinking that's required? And then they've taken these components and basically synthesized it into what we're calling our STAR Blitz curriculum. We used to call it PDSA for EOC success. This time between DBA and the EOC exam, or STAR for 7th and 8th grade, what are we doing? And so this is actually, it's a problem bank, but what it is a problem bank combined with questions. Before I even begin working the problem, what do I need to ask myself? And it's a whole series, and we've used some technology to incorporate some spinners and things like that to, okay, let's see what questions we're going to ask ourselves for this one. So that really helps them engage their own thinking too when I'm presented next time with a problem. What do I need to ask myself before I just sit down and start crunching numbers? We did use ESSER funds this previous year to hire a teacher on special assignment who has been focused specifically on junior high math. So in her role, she has been providing training, meeting with teachers for planning and coaching, writing some curriculum, and really she's instrumental in this preparing for that Intensified Algebra 1 rollout that I talked about, because there's a lot of pre-work to get done to help support teachers and make sure that's a successful rollout. Questions about junior high math?
Any questions from the board on this report?
Okay.
All right, thank you. All right, item 6.04, TASB Board Policy Update 118. Ms. Tuttle.
As you're aware, the legal policies, the exhibits and regulations do not require any approval, but I want to find out if there are any questions that I can address for you this evening.
Are there any questions? This is our standard rollout of, legal requirements due to new legislation.
So just a couple questions, Cicely.
Yes,
This is update 118?
that's correct.
Okay, so this is always a red flag for me, and I just want to kind of understand why. So
Okay.
last year, September, we did update 117. We got it in the work session, and then we voted on it in the regular session. And tonight, we're getting it in the work session. We're also voting it in the work session. So is there some timeline that we need to get this done by, that we need to vote on it tonight? Is that why it's coming to us
So
on the same night?
That's a great question. Our typical practice is to bring it to a work session and then a board meeting. But I will let you know that as a result of the most recent variant that we experienced in January and February, our goal, there's no timeline or deadline, but our goal is always to try to bring these to you within 2.5 to 3 months of our receipt of them. Because as you are aware, we're always getting this information delayed from TASB because they are updating all of the policies. And we had all of our policy meetings scheduled for the month of January, and in light of everything that was going on, we moved all of those off the books and rescheduled them. So this was more our attempt at getting the information to you as quickly as we could so that we can make sure that we're updating those policies. Certainly, we understand that statute goes into effect when it goes into effect, but when we've done this in the past, and there have been several times over the last several years when we've done it this way, what we've always committed to the board has been that they would receive all of the materials 2 weeks in advance prior to the work session where we were going to be approving them. And that certainly isn't something we do often, but that was the case for this particular meeting as well.
And I'm less concerned and I'm less uncomfortable if what we're doing here is basically a cut and paste from the change in the laws. That
Absolutely.
There's nothing in here that we've added to, thrown in there along with it. These are the laws, we're updating our policies consistent with those laws.
That is
and we're able to
absolutely-
say that. If we're able to say that, I'm much more comfortable.
The only thing, I always want to be fully transparent, the only thing you would see that would be different in our policies from 118 than other districts, for example, one of the regulations, it has blanks for you to fill in who your contact person is. For example, we've listed our Director of Information Services. Now, Mr. Brown, there are times when our local policies, which I know that's not the particular agenda item we're discussing, do require us to have some discussions and to make some choices between this verbiage or another verbiage. That was not the case in any of our policies for 118. So to answer your question, we've not customized any of our policies except for the customizations that are required in order for us to fill in all of the blanks and make sure that folks understand who to contact or what our particular contact individual is.
Okay. And for that reason, I'm comfortable with
Right.
this. I just think as a best practice, we get it work session and regular session, but for tonight, I'm fine with that. There was a point on the open forum that this was not on the public agenda. Do you know if that's accurate, and if
That
so,
is
why?
accurate, and I will tell you, I'm happy for us to look at that as a practice. What I will say is those policies have never been public. And I can't tell you that there's a specific reason for that, but it's certainly not in an effort to, conceal anything. We have never, in my experience in the time I've been in human resources, had those out there. They've always been in administrative so that you review them, and once they're approved, they then the next day do become public. They're not in executive, meaning that they don't stay private. But to your point, that's certainly a practice we can consider. There's nothing that I can share with you about why that has to be done or why that has been the case. That's just the practice we've always followed.
Yeah, and my preference, unless there's objection from the board, if we're getting something on our agenda to vote on that's not confidential, I think our practice should be to have it on the agenda publicly.
We will absolutely
for
look
it to be
into
seen.
that. Absolutely.
Okay.
Any other questions?
All right, financial statements for the month of February 2022. Mr. Williams.
Good evening. How is everybody? Yay. Okay, we're going to be looking at the financial statements for the month ended February 28th, 2022. That's a typo on my part, excuse me. It says 21 up there. Anyway, let's move. Oh, I can do it right here. Oh, you got it. We'll start off with the general fund. As you can see, we have a fund balance of $220,304,757. That represents revenues over expenditures of $77,435,433. You can reference these on pages 2 through 6, the detail for more detail than we're going to delve into tonight. But what you basically need to look at is total expenditures as of the end of February are at 44.96%, and of course we're halfway through our budget year, so we're below 50%, so that's good. Overall expenditures, I will point out, they're down slightly due to a payroll reclassification of $4.8 million, which we moved from general operating expense into ESSER 2 funds, which enabled us to, if you think back and we did the I want to call it the wrong thing, the $1,000 one-time stipend for employees, that enabled us to do that. But other than that, everything else is tracking normally for the general fund, and as we move through here, you'll see that 4.8 number pop up a couple of times. So the next report is the Wrestler report. You can look at that on page 7 of your financials. Payroll of $76,023,754 for the period is currently at 86%. Of course, y'all have heard me say many times 87% is where we typically run, and that is where we typically run. But again, that $4.8 million we reclassified kind of skewed that number a little bit this month, so it's down to 86%. Our number two expenditure at 2% is utilities, $2,094,880. And at 1% is instructional supplies, coming in at $1,106,306 million. Food service fund. We have a fund balance of $8,390,657. This represents revenues over expenditures of $2,017,311. These are referenced on page 89 of your detail. Total expenditures at the end of February were at 34.58% of budgeted, well below the 50% where we are for the year. So everything is tracking normally, and this department continues to do extremely well with the number of people they've got working. They're working really hard, and we have to really appreciate those ladies for what they're doing, keeping our kiddos fed. Debt service fund, you can reference on pages 10 and 11. We have a fund balance of $42,978,859. This represents revenues over expenditures of $29,998,182. Is that an 8 or 6? I think it's an 8. Our first debt service payment, of course, was made back in February. We will make our next debt service payment, which will be on August 15th, later in the year, to complete our budgeted amount of $36,784,564. And this fund, of course, is tracking. It's just an in and out fund. It's tracking as expected. Pre-K CK, referenced on page 13 and 14. We have a fund balance of $247,084 and 91 cents. That represents revenues over expenditures of $227,059. Yeah, I need to bring my other glasses, or my glasses, I guess, or look here. Total expenditures are at 44.87% of budget. So again, it's where it's tracking where it needs to be for the year, and the program is doing very well. Special revenue, as we've talked about in all the past meetings, these are multiple funds consisting of federal, state, and local grant programs. These are referenced on page 16 through 18 of your financials. These funds are, as we always say, they're self-sufficient. They're an in and out fund also. We budget and spend what is allotted to us through these various programs. You will note this last month, or end of February, there was a $5.2 million deficit, which again was mainly attributable to the $4.8 million in ESSER II funds reclassification. So 23.34% of budget, which is for these funds, the federal funds, that's very normal because we haven't drawn down a lot of those funds. So the program is tracking very normally. Campus Activity Fund balance of $3,063,810, revenues over expenditure of $111,291. Of course, referenced on page 19 and 20 for more detail. This fund is tracking just as normally as it can. Fundraising activities are doing well, and they're doing what they need to do. Series 2018 Bond Fund. We have a fund balance of $28,013,462. These represent expenditures over revenues of $5,261,054. If you reference your detail on pages 22 and 23, you'll note that we just don't get any revenues into this fund because we don't put it in there unless we sell bonds. And right now we have no authorization to sell bonds at this point. So what else we got here? The majority of these current expenditures are finishing up and paying for the retainages on completed projects. So as we get closer to the end, we'll see where we land with that. And then the remainder of these funds, as we talked about back in the facilities meeting, will be used on the Bel Air rebuild project. The locally defined capital projects fund has a fund balance of $47,971,383. This represents expenditures over revenues of $459,902, similar to the bond funds. These are referenced on pages 24, 25. Of course, these are referenced funds that are only transferred into this fund when the board decides to take excess fund balance or a gain in a year and place them into that fund. Most of these funds are currently being used for the transition center remodel and the other projects we discussed back in the November 2021 facilities meeting. So all in all, everything is doing very well, tracking right where it needs to be. So any questions?
Any questions on the financial presentation? No. All right, thank you, Dobie. Let's see. Budget transfer amendments requests.
This month, this is a very minimal request. We have a request to move $220 into instruction function 11 for health services for instructional supplies, and then into from 11 into Fund 36 for visual performing arts entry fees and truck rentals. So very minimal request for transfer this month. Any questions on that?
Any questions on the fund request or transfer request? All right, quarterly investment report for quarter ending February 2022.
Alrighty. Of course, the Public Funds, Texas Public Fund Investment Act calls for us to do a quarterly report each to the board, present it to the Board of Trustees. This basically, it shows the beginning and ending balances of our funds as well as the average yield to maturity. This is for the quarter ending February of 2022. Do you have any questions on that report?
Any questions from the board? Thank you. McGraw-Hill Math Materials, grade 6 through 8.
I think the remainder of these were outlined in the Friday update, and
Yeah.
may have various people that may want to speak if there are questions on that, so.
All right, questions on the math materials? All right, hearing none. Any questions on the Prospering Pals Child Nutrition Cooperative interlocal agreement with Capella ISD? All right. Request for proposal 22-03 CTE supplies, equipment, service and related items. Any questions on this one? And TASB interlocal participation agreement for autos and general liability insurance. Any questions on that? I know some additional information was provided. All right, we're down to action items. First is consider approval of the TASB Board Policy Update 118, revisions to localized policy. Any questions on the additions to localized policy? All right, hearing none, I will accept a motion.
I move that the board approve the localized policy revisions as submitted.
Second.
I have a motion and a second for the board to approve the localized policy revisions as submitted. Please vote. That motion passes. All right, 8.02, consideration of approval of board resolution to ratify the district school health advisory council. Ms. Tuttle?
Are there any questions, excuse me, about this resolution?
Any questions on the resolution? Hearing none, I'll accept a motion.
I move the board approve the resolution ratifying the district's school health advisory council.
Second.
I have a motion and a second for the board to approve the resolution ratifying the district's school health advisory council. Please vote. That motion passes. Consider approval of 2022-2023 staffing table update, new units.
I don't have any new information, but I just want to say, I think it is important to note that 16 teacher, 26 teacher assistant units is 42 instructional units that are being asked for your consideration for our staff and our students, most importantly. So we want to say thank you for your consideration.
I know we've had this information for a couple weeks now, I believe, so are there any questions? All right, hearing none, I'll accept the motion.
I move that the board approve the new units as submitted.
Second.
I have a motion and a second for the board to approve the new units as submitted. Please vote. And that motion passes. 8.04, consideration of approval to change in board operating procedures. That is one that I added. I wanted to offer this to the board to clean up some wording that we had in our section about choosing board officers. Wanted to make it clear in terms of keeping us out of any quorum issues. So hopefully you all have had a chance to review that, and I'll answer any questions if you have any. All right, hearing none, I'll accept a motion.
I move that the board approve the changes to the board operating procedures as submitted.
Second.
I have a motion and a second that the board approve the changes to the board operating procedures as submitted. Please vote. And that motion passes. All right, we're ready for open forum 2. No cards? Okay. All right, Stephen Beckman.
Sorry, I didn't plan on this, so this is really just in response to some of the comments made during the ERG updates. We're talking about the effects of online learning and things that happened as though they were things that just happened to the district. Okay, Mr. Cargile, we spoke after the end of last meeting, you might recall, so this will be what you and I read. Y'all are the governing body. All the things that we're talking about, we just throw our hands up and say, well, COVID, golly gee, that was so rough, and we see the impact of it. Those were y'all's policies, okay? All the online learners, the CK pre-K and the kids in kinder that we allowed to go virtually, so now we had first graders roll in day one of school, had been in school a day in their life. The 50% of kids that were online in high schools, and then we're looking at the impact of that. You had every opportunity in real time, and this isn't Monday morning quarterback. Okay, there are some of us who've been banging this drum for quite a while. Some of us who've been coming pretty consistently and speaking our piece, advocating for kids. And y'all had the opportunity to make some changes there. At any point, you could have looked at the achievement of some of those kids online. We had kids online that all but disappeared. Like they were gone. Didn't access the curriculum for almost a year. We could have at some point looked at that and said, this is not a successful setting for y'all. We're going to need you to come back to school. That is easily something that was within your jurisdiction. Could have done that. So I'm with you, Mr. Romero. No more excuses. And this isn't meant to be, I'm hopeful that this is just an encouragement for y'all to listen, please, to the public. We're not just here to be a thorn in your side or to make your life difficult for the 3 minutes that we get to be in your presence. There are some of us that have been advocating and speaking our minds, and y'all just go on with life as though we're not even here. So the online stuff, Ms. Ross, it was a disaster, but you'll also recall that we had a special meeting this year as to whether or not to impose it again on kids. So we're talking out of both sides of our face. We're saying, gosh, virtual learning was really rough, and we're seeing the impact, and we're not even counting some kids' data because of what that looked like last year for our DBAs and things. And yet just a few months ago, we're here for a 4-hour-long meeting whether or not to have virtual option again, right? And the only reason that didn't happen was Mr. Brown asked one simple question, hey, what's this gonna look like for special ed kids? And the whole thing fell apart. So I just want to encourage y'all, okay, the 7 of y'all, okay, you have the ability to make these changes. All I get to do is come up here every couple of weeks or send an email or whatnot. That's the extent of my influence. Y'all can actually make changes. So don't just, it's not good enough anymore to say, man, that COVID, that sure was rough. It was rough, but we also have to have some ownership on our role that we played. And that's it for me. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, item 10.01, opportunity for board members to request items be placed on future board agendas. Does anyone have anything? All right, review of board activity chart. Do I have the chart back? You haven't seen it? Okay, I'll pass it down to
I
you.
need to start passing it directly to Julie.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it stops here and I don't see it.
I'll just pass it to Julie.
Let's see, in terms of coverage. Looks like we have all events covered. No, you're right. All right, looks like someone's going to everything except for prom right now. Okay, here you go. All right, report on proposed changes to district budget presentation. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Matt. This conversation comes out of some of the actions and experiences from last budget session that I thought could be improved upon. And so I have four recommendations to bring to the board tonight. And before I get to them, I want to let you know how I've gotten here. Joe and I have sat down and we've worked together on all of these. I presented them to him and I asked him 2 things. I said, I also want you to talk to Dobie about this. tell me if any of these are objectionable, if they're a bad idea, because if they're a bad idea, I want to know why, because I don't want to take it to the board. If there's something that I'm not seeing. And two, is it feasible? Because I don't want to ask the administration to do anything that's overly burdensome or just not feasible, not workable. So each of these have been vetted and talked about, and I think that's important for you all to know before I bring them to you. So there's 4 things. Let me go through each of them. The first one is additional information for non-payroll budget requests. This is something that came up briefly last year. What I'm specifically talking about is the portion of the budget that is budget requests, which is non-payroll. You know, payroll makes up 87% of the budget. I'm not all concerned with how we get to those numbers. It's very clear how we get to those numbers. Those are our salaries. What is unclear in our budget is how we arrive at the numbers for our budget requests, which are our campus budget requests for our total campuses and our central office requests. For example, in our budget, it has a line item for the school board, $187,000. We get to that number somehow. I would just like to know how. And I would like that to be presented as part of the budget to be evaluated. One, we already have this information. So one of the requests that I made is, are we able to get that information? I don't want to be prescriptive on this is how I want you to present the information. I just want to know, are we able to get our information in such a way to package it to be presented with the budget without any additional work? And the response is yes, because we calculate these numbers anyway. It's just an additional layer of information to provide under the budget. It will help me get more comfortable on how we arrive at our numbers. And I want you to know this is not necessarily because I want to go in and start slashing the budget. It's actually more of the opposite, is are we funding our schools and our kids and we're putting our money where we want to support our programs. I can't look at our budget and tell you that we are, because I don't know where the money's going. There's a way to do that and to provide it to us that is not overly burdensome and will give us some justification on how we get to our numbers. One thing I want to impress upon you on this is I'm not asking for the board to approve the budget at any different level. We would still approve at the function level. It becomes very onerous if we start approving on an object or even lower down to the line item. I'm not asking that. That puts too much of a burden on the finance guys and gals. So the way we vote on the budget wouldn't change. The only thing that would change is more information to support the numbers. That's number one. Number two is all of that new information should not just come to me. It should come to the full board, and that's why I'm also bringing this to the board. Is I didn't want to. One, I didn't have the authority to dictate to Joe to say, when you bring the budget, I want all of these additional numbers. If the board's wishes is not to provide that additional numbers, it's not for me to dictate to Joe to get me those numbers. But I also don't want to ask for something that the full board doesn't get. We should all have the exact same information. And so my hope is when the budget is presented to us, this additional information is provided, all of us get the same information. We're all working off the same information, and just like we do today, is we're very transparent with the information on the budget that we have. It's up on the website, exactly what we get, and I would like that to carry on. The additional information that we get is also posted up on the website at the same time that we get it. So that's number two. Number three is the timing of the budget. And this may be the most important to me. It's that when we got our budget on Friday last year, Friday evening, that's the budget that we voted on Monday, the following Monday. And so my question was, can we get that sooner? Can we get it before the Friday, before we vote on it on Monday, the actual budget? And the answer is yes. There's not a specific date that I want the board to pinpoint, say we want the budget by this date, and this may be a bit of a moving target, and as we go forward, we can work on it. But I would endeavor to get the budget before Friday, before the Friday that we voted on Monday, and And Joe and Dobie have told me that that's workable, that's feasible, and so as soon as the budget is ready, I would like for us to get it, rather than it come in the agenda on the Friday agenda. And that's also doable. It gives us additional time to spend some time with the budget so we can get comfortable with it. And the last thing is, instead of doing a budget session with each individual member, I would like for us as a group to go through a budget session. Three reasons why, really. One, I don't like the fact that the first time we talked about the budget as a board was the night that we voted on it. If there are ideas or issues, I'd like that to be able to come out and talk about as a board. And we're not able to do that if we meet one-on-one. Because when we meet one-on-one, I don't get to hear the questions that everybody else has. Nobody gets to hear the questions that I have, and it's not conducive to any type of conversation. I think that the board, the budget is important enough to this board that we get a monthly financial presentation after the fact every month. I would like us to spend a little bit of time ahead of time as a board to talk about the budget before we vote on it. This also, instead of having the administration meet one-on-one 7 different meetings with each of us, it would be one meeting where we all get the same information and are able to talk about the budget prior to voting on it. And I'll leave that to Matt and to the administration to schedule what's the best time to do that, whether it's May, June, July, sometime before we vote on it. I'm not here to dictate what that date is, but if there's some consensus that the board is supportive of moving away from individual siloed budget meetings to one budget meeting as a board, then we can schedule that as necessary. So these are not drastic changes. I think these are incremental improvements. Quite frankly, it's not everything that I would like, but I think that these are low-hanging fruit that would make some real improvements in the process. That Joe, I'd like to thank you for working with me through this and getting it to a point where I can bring it to the board. But those are the 4 recommendations. And if anybody has any questions, we can certainly talk through those.
Especially having a group meeting would be better.
Does anybody have any questions or comments? I'm sorry, Don, I didn't mean to get you.
My question is really about and I don't remember which number it was, Chris, but about the additional detail. And I just want to hear from Joe and Dobie on, what the additional bandwidth necessary is for that, and what does that look like for you and your team?
I'll let Dobie give some specifics, but as we looked at the example of the board budget, we would run the report at the organizational level. The only concerns we had was we do have limitations on the reports as far as the number of characters, the descriptions. So we did have some concern there that there may be some confusion on some of those items. But as far as running those reports out of e-finance, we can run those reports.
I mean, for that example, I know that there's detail available because the board president and the superintendent look at the details of that board budget. I'm not as concerned about that one as an example, but if we're talking about something bigger, like athletics, how detailed are you looking for, and how much additional, I don't want it to take an inordinate amount of time. Right. In that if it's a Cognos report that you just click a button or two and it can spit it out, that seems reasonable. If you're talking about spending a lot of man hours on it, we have to talk about whether or not that's really necessary.
Right. And that would just depend on to what level we need to get, what kind of report we need to get that into, and within the capabilities of our system. I mean, we can certainly produce a report for each organization code or location code, as some people call that. For instance, the board budget would be a 702 code, so we can produce one at that level down to the object level fairly easily. I don't think that is difficult. Stephen might.
No, I know that's
like-
fairly easily, because as board president, I've seen it before, right? Again, that's not the one I'm the most worried about. When you're talking about bigger chunks of money with lots of little line items underneath it, that's where I get a little.
At some point, depending on how much detail you want to get, we would have to go back down into the budget managers and have them involved in that process, because they bring us the dollars. We give them allocations based on their number of students they have at their campuses, different things. So we don't, even at our level, get down into the
Right.
weeds of what they're budgeting each thing for. They may put, $300,000 into their supply budget for whatever. We don't get down into
Right.
the weeds of what those supplies are for, because that's the way budgets are intended to be built is at that level by the budget managers, not by at the district level. And then as those expenditures come forward out of that budget that the board approves, then that is when the board would look at those individual expenditures and what they're for and that are required for board approval based on our policy.
Right.
And that's when it gets approved by the board.
Right. So, Mr. Brown, are you
They're
talking?
really approving the budget in dollars, but you're not, the board wouldn't be approving the actual detailed expense
Okay.
of the budget. So.
Is that how you understand it too, Mr. Brown?
Yes, because I want us to stay away from approving the actual expenses, because that's not how we approve the budget.
Right.
But and I appreciate your example, because $187,000 for a board budget is different than, $1,393,000 for the athletic department.
Right.
But if we can pull the e-finance report, because at some point in time, we got to 1.3 million. I'd like to know how that money is spread around the athletic department. I'm not looking for anything other than the e-finance printout. And the e-finance printout would give us some level of detail on that $1.3 million for athletics.
Yes, we can give it to you at the, what's going to be spent on payroll, what's going to be spent on supplies, what's going to be spent on travel, what's going to be budgeted for other operating expense, which is basically means travel and stuff goes into there.
And that's all I'm looking for. When it's
Okay.
a supply
That's
budget, I
basically
don't
at the
care how
object-
many
object
pencils
level.
or staplers or staples are being purchased. If it's a supply budget, I'm not looking to go any deeper than that. And I think that doing the e-finance report will go to that level without having to go to the number of staplers. Is that right?
Yes, it will go to that level, yes.
That's all. That's all I want. I don't want anything more than that.
Yeah, I think I think it's obvious that we couldn't go below that level for approval, because that's just not our job. In terms of approving the budget, it's our job to approve a budget that the superintendent writes or makes written. And our job is to understand how that applies to the district meeting its goals. So I think you made a good point that, you'd like to see kind of the work behind everything so you can understand better where all that money's going. But the other question is, how do we as board members really know what's enough here, enough there? So you can get all that numbers, but then the question is, what do you do with it? How do you, it might take some further education or some further time to actually understand whether or not these numbers are adequate for what you're looking for them to do in terms of reaching individual goals. And that's something that we've always relied on the administration to, provide for us, is, assurances that that's meeting the goals. And then, of course, on the back end, we look at results versus what we spent. And, in terms of individual board meetings, the reason for that has always been because all board members have different levels of acumen when it comes to financial stuff. And being able to, but as board members, it's up to each of us to get as knowledgeable as we possibly can and try to sit down and, really understand where the money's coming from and where the money's going. And having those individual meetings is an opportunity for the administration to meet us wherever we are. I have an MBA, I've studied finance. I've, done a lot of stuff. I understand numbers. So when they're meeting with me, it's a different conversation than when they're meeting with someone else who doesn't have a financial background, and they can answer different questions. I don't think it's a bad idea to come together and have a meeting, and maybe the timing works out to where we allow board members to have individual meetings, and then, maybe we get the budget and have an open session discussion amongst the board, and then vote on it at the next meeting, something like that. I could see, so that kind of timing working out.
Sure, and my proposal is not to prohibit an individual meeting if it's warranted. If somebody wants to meet individually, that's great. The problem that I ran into last year was when we did individual meetings, once there was an issue, there was not a way to bring that to the board.
Just because the turnaround was too quick once.
Well, timing, and we didn't actually have an agenda item regarding the budget until we voted on the budget. At that point, it's too late.
Okay.
So I'm not trying to stop anybody from meeting and getting any information they want, but as an added layer, if necessary.
You can do budget teams, do budget team meetings. That's a good. Put two people together who have the same level of knowledge.
Or they ask a lot of questions.
They'll ask all the questions.
All right.
I think the only thing I was confused on, Chris, was the number 3, the timing of the budget before the vote. Because we saw, my individual meeting was before we voted on it, before we got it that Friday.
Yeah, but you didn't get the actual budget. It was a different packet. So the packet that we met with in May, when we did our individual budget meetings, is a different packet than we got the Friday before the vote on Monday.
The numbers are the same.
Yeah, because there were options.
Right, so there, and that's why I think we can get the budget sooner, because it's basically, I won't put a percentage on it, but we know what we're gonna do with the budget far in advance. So I know we can get the budget sooner, because we have a budget meeting, our individual budget meetings were in May. It's not the actual budget, but it's very much almost there.
Yeah.
So, you're right. I don't want to discount the fact that we were given information ahead of time, but the actual budget that we vote on was not given to us until Friday before the Monday vote.
Yeah. We made a huge, decision on our budget tonight by adding more people. So, those are the two main things that we do in those budget meetings is we talk about how many people we're gonna have, and we talk about any kind of pay raise and how that's gonna be covered. And then there's always, 3 options in terms of worst case, probable case, and best case scenarios in terms of, looking, 5 years out in the future. I guess we'd have to talk about the best way to get all that information and.
Well, if the timeline is compressed, instead of having 7 meetings, you have 1 meeting, and you have that meeting early, it seems reasonable that then, the timeline could be, then we get the actual budget and have a period of time before the vote. That seems reasonable, but it would just maybe require, because we're asking for additional work that wasn't there before, so doing that, the burden would be on you at the beginning, but not so much throughout the month of May with those individual meetings. Does that seem reasonable?
Yes. And the budget, you're correct. What we bring in May is the non-payroll budget, basically. That's pretty much it. The only thing that will change on the expenditure side from there until we adopt in August is if data comes in or something comes in to, like, for instance, say,
legislation.
We're using, or some expenditure crops up over the summer that we didn't know we were gonna have to budget for, so we gotta add it in there. Or,
When you've got to wait for the tax rolls.
yeah, that, on the revenue side, that's like the earliest we could bring the total completed, this is what you're gonna vote on and approve budget would be after July 25th, when those tax rolls come in, and then we have time to sit down and work through all those numbers and do all that. And then, so early August, we can probably, bring you that completed. But on the expenditure side, that should not really change. And if something major did change from the time we met with you in May until then, we would certainly bring that to your attention and say, this is what changed this. You could, like, for instance, we're using estimated numbers on some of the budgets for property and casualty insurance, which
Right.
can be a huge number and can.
Could change
and can
drastically.
fluctuate drastically. So if it comes in exceptionally higher when we get final quotes that we've solicited from all these different places, and that we would bring to your attention, say this is gonna impact our expenditure side of our budget, so.
Yeah.
But,
Okay.
yeah, absolutely, we can produce whatever it is the board decides they want to have us produce.
All right, so this was a discussion item, not really an action item, so do you have a suggestion on where we should go from here?
Well, if there's consensus that this is the direction that the board would like to go, I think we can give that direction. If there's dissension, I would then put this on an agenda for an action item and make a vote. I don't sense that there's objection, but if there is consensus, I think that can be the direction that the changes would be these 4 items going forward. If everybody's all right with it.
I'm okay with it. I won't object to it. I like the one-on-one meetings and they work for me. I don't need any more, a little extra detail maybe, going down one more layer, but I won't be the holdout if a group meeting is.
But he's
the
saying you can
consensus.
still have your individual meeting if you think that that's gonna help you, and you can continue to do that.
I'd
But
rather just
get
have
the
one,
data.
but.
Well, no, still have the individual meeting, but then we'll get the data to a little earlier, so before we vote, basically is what he's saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and administration doesn't have a problem with, okay.
A high level, not taking a lot of people's time.
No,
Report.
if we sit down and say, we figure out, okay, this is gonna take an inordinate amount of time, then I'll get back with Joe and say, okay, we didn't think about this, but this may.
All right, so let's leave it at, we're gonna work towards this, and it means we don't have a perfect solution yet, but we're gonna work on it, and we can keep fine tuning it as we go.
I think that's very fair.
Okay. All right.
And I'll get together with Dobie and look at those reports a little more in detail. And again, we looked at a couple examples, we'll look at a couple more, and then kind of look at what that meeting could potentially look like, and if there is any other, issues that we need to bring forward to you, and we can have that ready for you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. All right, now we're gonna do plus deltas for the extra mile celebration.
Okay, so plus deltas, I'm going to ask for a new process here, because Steve would always come up here, he'd grab that whiteboard or his marker, and he wrote it out. No. I'm going to ask you to fill out a sticky note. Please put a big plus or delta, and I will gladly read them. But as a left-handed science major, I'm not writing up here.
All right. Well, I know Mr. Cargile had some great suggestions while we were actually still there.
On the stage.
Yeah,
But I know he's not gonna wanna write them out.
No, Joe will. I will write those out
So-
because they were good.
Or I can have ask the board secretary to write them for him.
Oh, okay, very good. That way I can collect it.
Oh, that's me.
That's you.
Oh, I just wrote 2 on my own,
Once
so.
you have your stickies, let me know, and again, put a plus and a delta, and then I will put them up here, and then I will read them.
All right, Andy, what were yours so that Rochelle can write them down for you?
Can't remember what
Find
they
a
were.
better way to keep people there to the end.
Yes, get the big award at the end.
Big award at the end.
Individual,
How many people would you say left in the middle? Like,
at least half left.
wow.
Does that usually happen?
I don't remember.
It doesn't usually happen because we're usually in a banquet setting, so.
Yeah,
What was it at?
It was at LD
it was
Bell.
at Bell in the auditorium,
Yeah.
and that's
so-
my delta.
Why did we have it in the Bell Auditorium and not at the Buinger like we have in the past?
We've done it at the
I've been to it at Bell
I've
before.
not been to it.
I,
It was many years ago, but I remember it being in that
I
format.
think as
think
long
it
as
was-
I've been
I
there
remember.
twice, it's been at the Buinger.
I remember a conversation about wanting to be able, if people felt like they wanted to distance, they could do that in the auditorium, but there wasn't enough room to do that in the Buinger.
The Buinger is it's a pretty facility, but it is also much smaller.
Yeah,
The Buinger is much smaller.
we moved it to Bell.
The Bell Auditorium.
Is Pat May not an option?
Is what?
Pat May not an option?
Oh, it was booked.
It was booked. Okay.
Yeah, it was just, when, the biggest group was like the first group, and once they came through and the winner got announced, that group and their families all got up and kind of went to
Well,
dinner.
and the other problem was moving everyone from where they were having the food in the cafeteria to the auditorium. We were not able to start on time because people were still in transit.
To me, it felt, at Bell, it felt more disconnected because people weren't sitting towards the front. Lots of people were sitting towards the back. People were kind of in there, and there were schools that sat together, and they were still, like, one of my favorite things about Extra Mile is how the schools cheer for, their people. South Hurst-Euless is like my favorite because they just get so excited about their nominees, but it just felt, it was still a great night and a great celebration. It just felt more disconnected in the auditorium than it had at the Buinger.
And I have to be honest, Mr. Cargill mentioned his idea, and at first, I'm like, that's a great idea, but I didn't understand the why, because I was sitting in the second row facing forward, so I didn't know that we were losing crowd as it went along. So so our plus, it says the food by Child Nutrition. So Child Nutrition put out a great spread, and
Want
we
me to
had.
keep writing if that
Oh,
was one of
if
mine
you've
too?
got more, keep going.
Okay.
But I'll start going through these.
Bill, I have a question while you're organizing.
Yes.
I thought it was quite embarrassing when you only have 3 people nominated for one area. And we have 20 elementaries and 7, 8 count keys. It seemed like, I always thought when I was principal, we'd nominate someone in every category. And if I didn't have one, I would call transportation and ask transportation, hey, who's doing a great job and not getting accolades? And I would nominate that person, if I didn't have one from my school. I just thought it was embarrassing when you have 3 people in one category.
Yeah, I think that was.
One's a winner, and then there's second, third place.
I agree, Andy, but I think there were a lot of people that didn't show up that were nominated. There was, the smallest group had 5 or 6 nominations, but there were only 3 people that attended.
Like, it seems like this, I think he's got a good point, the secretary category, like, every school nominates one of their secretaries, but
We'll remind the campuses to put just as much thought into the other categories as they do, because you are correct. There are 2 or 3 categories that get a large number of nominations, and then other categories that have less.
technology.
Yeah. So we have a second plus, and it was the plus was the organizing by Ty and Sylvia for the nominees to the stage, getting that all lined up. Oh, well,
They got them in alphabetical order.
we keep coming here. Love the celebration.
I love the celebration.
Okay. And then the food was fun. Okay, and so then we just added the one Delta need more nominees in the same category. We had a comment not at the Bell Auditorium, so I think some of us did not. And then we have again, move back to CTE. Okay. Okay, and so this was a new one, a money award or possibly, some sort of cash award for the top prize. All right, and
Foundation involved.
so, and then
I'm not going back to the foundation.
what goes, find a better way to keep people to the end. 50% of the people left, so one of the suggestion was, what if we announce everyone who's been nominated, so they come up and get their first small reward, recognition, but then we don't name the final winner for each category until the end, which I do think, honestly, is a neat idea, because then we're bringing all 7 of those winners up on stage together, and then everyone has to stay to see who did win, and we have a huge crowd cheering all of those finalists. So I do think that could be a really neat idea. It said start with.
It just takes more time in the middle, people walking from their seat. And I think that was originally why we had everybody lined up, so that we don't have that time of walking from the seat. But
Well, and I do remember, yeah, getting them lined up was a huge change, because when they all came out of the seats, I remember that many, many years ago, and that took some time. Again, not in the auditorium, and then start with the smaller groups and then work up to the larger groups, because we started with one of the largers. So we will take these, and Ty will get these all marked up, and then we will work on.
One I didn't write down, but it's the same every year. Mark Chandler does an excellent job as NC, so.
He does.
Mark's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
He
you know,
gets those names right.
and Mark also was at one act play that day and raced back to make sure he was there to do that. Yeah.
Good.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right, thank you, board. At this time, we're going to adjourn to closed session. Pursuant to Texas Open Meetings Act, Texas Government Code, Chapter 551, the board will adjourn to closed session to discuss Section 551.071 to 551.074. We are in closed session.
Hey, just tell me how much the raise is.
Okay, thanks for getting this right.
At 12, that's what you thought, right? I think so. Okay, it said it on the calendar, we just want to make sure we didn't. Yes, no. You'll get an email in the morning. Perfect, thanks.
No, those knobs have always been there.
Okay, well, I didn't know. Oh, yeah, I
They're,
see it.
yeah, they're all over the place.
All right, we have returned to open session. This time I'll accept a motion to adjourn.
So moved?
We are adjourned.
Appointment, employment, evaluation, reassignment, duties, dismissal. Would it be to hear?
1104, it says, discipline or dismissal of a public officer or employee, but we're public officers.
To hear a complaint, public officer complaint.
Just write public officer.
Personnel if you want to, but that suffices too.